I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. As a reminder to our listeners, in honor of our 1-year anniversary as a podcast, we are giving away a virtual home energy audit to one lucky listener. To enter the drawing, head over to our website and send us a note. Just include your first name and tell us you'd like to be entered into the drawing. And I think last week I said we're going to pull the name on the 9th, but we're pulling the name on the 19th. That's September 19th. So you have a few weeks to get it done. Head over to the website, submit a comment with your name, and tell us you'd like to be entered into the drawing. So it's hard to really overstate the value that our forests provide. We get everything from clean water to flood prevention to housing, really much of the world's biodiversity. And in addition to all those things, forests also, breathe in and store billions of tons of carbon dioxide each year. And, in a world where we're desperately need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, forests have a potential to play a critical role in solving the climate crisis. So today, we're going to geek out on trees and their role in helping us fight climate change with an expert from the World Wildlife Fund. And speaking of forests, have you had a chance to get out and spend any time in them this year?
I am one with the forest. No, I have a little bit. I mean, I would like to a lot more than I have. Although, speaking of big trees, I just recently, when we were at the coast, we were at Cape Mears, and it has the largest Sitka spruce out there in Oregon. And we hiked in like quarter mile or whatever and saw it. It was bigger than I thought it was going to be. And pictures can't really, how pictures can't really do it justice because you can't really see scale. But yeah, I mean, it's like 144 feet tall, like 50 feet in circumference.
That's massive.
Yeah, it's like might be 800 years old.
Whoa, that's
yeah,
crazy.
it's a cool tree. It was really cool. They have something else out there called the octopus tree. They don't really know why it grew that way, but it has just like. And I thought, it's going to be this little tree with just like these little limbs out of it, that are all kind of going in different directions. But it's massive too. So yeah, this episode reminded me of those two big trees and those tree spirits. The Ents for the Lord of the Rings fans.
Well, California is the reason for this week's Reason for Hope. They are kicking off a project to cover some of their, agricultural canals with solar panels. And it's modeled after some projects that have been done in Gujarat, India, where they've done this. And the goal is really twofold. I mean, you know, in a warming world, you get to save water because you're helping limit the amount of evaporation and, obviously producing renewable energy at the same time. The initial project that they're doing is fairly modest. They're, looking at covering roughly a mile of canal with solar panels. But the intent is for this really to be a pilot because California as a state has almost 4,000 miles of canals.
Right.
And so there was a study that was done, and I think this in some ways precipitated this pilot project, but they said if they were to cover all the canals, which obviously 4,000 miles is a lot of canal, it would produce enough clean energy to meet about half of the state's goal there and save enough water to irrigate roughly 50,000 acres. So, so we're talking real savings here. You start putting down miles of solar panels.
That's just from the evaporation, huh? Just the Wow, that's crazy. They're in dire straits when it comes to water, really.
I think their worst drought in over 1,000 years. So,
well, that'd be
not
awesome.
good.
Yeah, that'd be cool if they get that going.
Indeed. So our guest this week to help us get smart on the power of forests to fight climate change is Kerry Cesareo, Senior Vice President for Forests at the World Wildlife Fund. Kerry leads a portfolio of strategic initiatives to help conserve the world's most important forests, initiatives that focus on everything from halting illegal logging to addressing threats from agricultural expansion to investing in forests as a tool to mitigate climate change. Kerry holds a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's in environmental management. And we're super excited to have her on the pod today. Kerry, welcome to Climate Optimist.
Thanks for having me.
So, we'll start you out with a basic question. When you think about efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
Okay, this is going to sound a little corny and maybe expected coming from someone who leads forest conservation, but trees make me hopeful, and I mean that in the serious sense that trees are one of the best available technologies we have to address climate change, and we already have them. We don't need to build them. We don't need to, they're there. They're doing their job. They store and absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and if we protect them, if we take care of them, they'll take care of us. Now, obviously, we need to first and foremost cut fossil fuel emissions. There's no getting out of that. But forests are a really critical part of the solution to achieving the Paris Agreement. And it's been exciting for me to see that it's not just me, someone who works on forest conservation for their day job, that has realized that there's a growing realization of the importance of conserving forests and nature. We're seeing that from everything from at the most recent climate COP to mainstream media. It
Right.
feels a little bit like forests and trees are having a bit of a moment, and so that that's really exciting for me. And just like at a basic level, like I'm sitting in my home office right now and I'm looking at trees, and it's hard not to feel hopeful when you're looking at a tree. I mean, here you have something that's so impossibly huge and solid that came from a tiny little seed. And you just feel like trees are very determined and they don't give up. And so we shouldn't either. And I think that is a source of a sort of daily inspiration for me.
I like it. I confess that I too really get inspired by the trees. So, I'm in your camp. Um, well, I'm going to talk about obviously deforestation, reforestation, etc. How did you get into working in forests?
Yeah, well, I was always interested in science and the natural world, like how things worked, being outdoors. And then I did spend several months after college literally hugging trees. So I was part of I was part of helping to conduct research in North Carolina, and we had to measure the diameter
Oh
of
yeah.
lots of trees. And so I was literally hugging trees. But I think the real turning point for me was I did have this opportunity to spend time in the magnificent forests of the Pacific Northwest, in a place called Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, working with First Nations and forest companies and communities, and really trying to figure out, how do we save these beautiful places and deliver all the benefits that come from forests. And that just had a really life changing impact on me.
Well, that's sort of a nice lead in. I mean, the forests of BC are hard to beat, but when when we're talking about the world's forests, where are sort of the most critical when we're talking about like sequestering carbon, and why are those forests? I mean, people are familiar with the Amazon, but like, where are these big forests that are so critical to protect?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I do love the coastal temperate rainforests of British Columbia, the reality is that tropical rainforests are by far the most important ecosystems for mitigating climate change. They collectively sequester more carbon from the atmosphere than other forest types, and they're also being increasingly destroyed for things like agriculture expansion. So they're super important and they're being lost. And so when we consider you mentioned the Amazon, and that is one of the three largest tropical rainforests in the world. There's also the Congo Basin and the remaining tropical rainforests in Southeast Asia. And each of those is sort of on a little bit of a different pathway in terms of how much has been lost. And that affects their ability to absorb, like whether they are a carbon sink or source. So, unfortunately, in Southeast Asia over the past 20 years, we've lost so much forest that it has now flipped to being a net source of carbon emissions, due to forest being cleared for plantations, for things like pulp and palm oil and rubber, and the fires that have ensued from some of that forest clearance. In the Amazon, we are nearing a tipping point, but not quite there yet in terms of it becoming a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. And then, so of the three largest tropical rainforests in the world, it's really only the Congo Basin that has enough standing forest to remain a strong net carbon sink. Now, that isn't to say we should give up hope. In fact, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity and still a lot of reason to protect those forests. But those are among the regions of the world with really important forests. And I also just say that, it's protecting remaining standing forests is important, and particularly primary or what we might call mature secondary forests, because those forests have a lot more potential in terms of the carbon stored and the amount of carbon that they sequester versus if you looked at a forest that was only planted in the last 20 years.
So for us in the northern hemisphere, it would be like our more of our old growth forests as opposed to
Exactly.
a
Yes,
forest that,
exactly.
is maybe 20, 30 years old, but the trees are still relatively small and, don't have that surface area and aren't, as a result pulling in as much carbon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's important to give these young forests a chance to grow as well into old ones, but the carbon that's released into the atmosphere from these sort of like eons of carbon released when we clear forests that are, hundreds, in some cases, thousands of years old.
Wow. So I know some folks are probably, versed on the fact that, trees obviously store carbon above ground and what's visible, but there's a vast amount of storage that occurs underground as well. Can you give us a sense? I mean, as we're talking about tropical forests, for instance, roughly how much of the carbon is stored underground versus kind of above ground? Like, what do we see versus what's, out of sight?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's some recent research that showed that it didn't break it down into above and below ground per se, but looked at about it's like 45% of forest carbon stock is in the living biomass. So that would be the trunk and the leaves, but it also includes the roots, which are sort of out of sight. And then 45% is in the soil organic matter, so other parts of the forest that are other living parts of soil, and then 10% in even just the dead downed branches, what would be considered like dead wood and litter. But I think the point you're getting at is that there are particular forests in the world that are on peat soils in particular that store a vast amount of carbon and that are very much at risk when the forests are cleared to releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. And so we have to really think about forests as a whole system, right? It's not just the removal of the trees.
So in a sense, it's like you've got these different kind of buckets of carbon. You've got you know, the trunk, let's say, which, if it's cut in theory, as long as it's not decomposing, there's still carbon stored there. But once you do that, the tree is no longer sequestering carbon. So maybe that's kind of another bucket. It's no longer doing its job. And then it sounds like the third is really like all the stuff that's gone on underground that if as soon as you're disturbing that soil, it's releasing a lot of that, back up into the
Yeah,
atmosphere.
it's underground. It's also sort of the damage to the surrounding area, right? So if you were just say you're removing even just one tree, you may be, there's vines that are maybe attached to that tree or other plants, and so there's this collateral damage that happens when we're removing trees.
So let's talk about the upside then. So, obviously trees are powerful instruments in storing carbon and doing a host of other things as well. Um, if we were to focus our efforts on, things like reforestation and conservation, what what's sort of the additional potential in terms of our forests being able to store carbon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's actually some recent research on this that found that there was nearly 300 billion metric tons of unrealized potential storage opportunity in forests. So that's
Wow.
significant. And what was noteworthy about that is it's like three quarters of that is actually linked to managing our forests better. So I think we've spent a lot of time focusing on, and it's really important. As I was saying, we got to keep forests standing, in particular these older, mature forests. There's a lot of attention on restoration and on tree planting, but there's this piece of managing our forests well that is really critical. So we have to do all three of these things, right? So conservation, restoration, and improved management, they're all part of the pathway to achieving a world in which we limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. I think, knowing kind of where the opportunities are, we have to be smart about what we invest in. There's a hierarchy of action here. So to put this in context, if you have an a hectare of tropical rainforest on an annual basis, if you conserve that, you're saving you're preventing the release of 100 metric tons of carbon from that hectare. So it's like halting loss on tropical forests avoids the release of 100 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year. If you attempt to restore tropical forests, you have opportunity to sequester 3 metric tons of carbon per hectare per year versus avoiding the release of 100 metric tons of carbon
Wow.
per year per hectare. So we first and foremost always want to stop the bleeding, right? Like we got to keep
Right.
keep the trees in the ground, keep the carbon in the ground. It's a lot harder to put forests back. Definitely want to prioritize protection. And then we have this data showing us of the potential for sequestration and absorbing carbon from just managing our forests better. Even if we're logging, there are ways to do that selectively that limit the damage that we were just talking about, where you might have narrower roads or you trim the vines before you cut the tree. I mean, there's all these practices that can be deployed to ensure that when we are managing forests and deriving responsible products from them, ideally certified under a recognized third-party certification system. Forest Stewardship Council is one of those outfits that helps to ensure responsible management is taking place. So we want to make sure we're managing responsibly, but then we also do need to restore. I mean, what the models are showing us is that in order to get to 1.5 degree target, we need to restore 678 million hectares of forest. So
Wow.
even though, in theory, it's like first we protect and then we manage, these forests and then, we restore. The reality is, given the urgency and the timeline we're on, we need to do these things simultaneously, but we can't trade off one for the other. Like we're not going to plant our way out of the crisis, but we do also need to be restoring forests. It's a vicious cycle where if you lose forests, you lose the capacity to absorb more carbon. But we can flip that to from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle, because the more forests that we protect, the better job we do of managing them. We reduce fire risk, we increase and enhance the capacity of forests to absorb carbon. And then there are all these benefits that accrue in addition to the climate mitigation benefit. I mean, forests themselves are actually protecting people from extreme weather. Obviously, it's well known the role they play in delivering clean water, fresh air. So we can invest in forests, to sort of save ourselves from climate, but in doing so, we get so much more in the process. So I think that's part of that virtuous circle that we can flip into, and I think is a source of optimism.
So I'm realizing I got excited. We started talking about trees, and I forgot to ask you. I think everybody inherently knows that deforestation is problematic for climate change and a host of other things. But what percentage is deforestation at this point kind of contributing to climate change? So those mature forests that you're talking about being taken down.
Yeah, I mean, it's significant. I think the destruction of forests and their ecosystems, together with their unsustainable use, is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the burning of fossil fuels. So it's really high on that list. And we know that addressing deforestation, as I said, is sort of fundamental to getting on that pathway. And it's actually the action with the largest potential to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to the land sector. So we know we need to be on that path, that trajectory, but unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction. So just last year, the tropics lost over 27 million acres of tree cover globally. And in just the first 6 months of 2022, the Amazon experienced the highest deforestation we've seen since 2016. The problem is, when we're losing those forests, we're losing the potential to absorb carbon as well. And so annually, forests absorb 1.5 times more carbon than the United States emits annually. So with each acre we lose the capacity to absorb carbon in that way. So that's kind of the trajectory we're on.
So not a great place, but I guess if being the eternal optimist, if we halt that, huge potential there.
That's right. We have the
So
tools to do it.
well, yeah, and I guess that's a great segue. when we're talking about solutions to all of this, um, what kind of policy mechanisms or other tools do we have at our disposal to sort of halt that deforestation that's occurring and to encourage this restoration of forest land that we need to do?
Yeah, generally speaking, we need government leadership that is backed by funding, effective policies, diplomatic engagement, and we want that aimed at protecting and restoring forests, as we've talked about, eliminating commodity driven deforestation because that is a big driver of forest loss, and governments do have an ability to regulate trade and engage on the role of commodities. We need to halt bad actors from illegally clearing land. So that's another place within which governments have a role to play in enacting and enforcing laws around land use planning, what areas should or should not be cleared for agriculture and other uses. And also there's a role for government to play in promoting sustainable livelihoods and recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities who have been stewards of this land. And really, there's no solutions, I think, to many of these problems that aren't working with and through the leadership of the people who live in and around forests. So those are sort of the roles that we see governments playing. And fortunately, there's a growing recognition of that. And we have countries inserting forests into the targets they're setting under the Paris Agreement. So saying, yes, we need to do the right things in the forest sector in order to achieve our goals. Here in the US, we've seen some recent action both by the Biden administration and by Congress. There's been an executive order by President Biden relating to deforestation. We recently had the Senate pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes provisions around forests. And there's some really exciting legislation being considered, something called the Forest Act, which is an acronym for it's fostering overseas rule of law and environmentally sound trade. And that would make it illegal to import commodities from illegal deforestation into the US. And so that's a piece of legislation that's been introduced. So progress being made on that front, but given the scale and the speed at which we need to move, companies have a role to play too. And so I think voluntary corporate action we see as being paired with government action is going to be key. And it's something that we're really keen to work with companies on to help them reduce their footprints on forests and make sure that they're investing in and contributing to conservation, improved management, and restoration of forests.
So that could be like a giant, let's say, food conglomerate that uses palm oil in a bunch of their products, and figuring out how to do that in a sustainable way, or perhaps finding other sources of oil instead of palm oil, those kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a platform called Forest Forward through which we're working with companies that touch on forests. And last year we announced a new partnership actually with HP, linked to their commitment, their existing commitment around forest conservation, in which they're going to invest $80 million in restoration, improved management, and conservation of critical forest areas around the world. And the area will be commensurate with the paper use that runs through all their printers on an annual basis over the next 10 years. And so that's
Oh,
the
that's great.
kind of scale of the commitment we're talking about, is to say, do I understand what my fair share, what my contribution is in the ways that companies are setting science-based targets around climate? Similarly, looking at that through the nature lens and saying, what needs to happen, and then how do we each do our part to contribute to that? So there's a lot of potential there, and I feel like it's only through the combination of private sector, governments, and then working, hand in hand with communities on the ground. That there's a real need for kind of a bottom-up, top-down aspect of this coming together, where we need to leverage the policy frameworks, the finance, but really understand the context of what is causing forest loss, how do we change that, and then to the extent that where good things are happening and forests are being conserved, how do we ensure the benefits of that flow to the communities and the stewards of those places?
Right. How do you incentivize the good behavior and reward those folks for doing the right thing?
Yeah, exactly.
So, Kerry, I would love to keep talking about forests, but want to always leave people with an opportunity to get engaged. if you were to kind of summarize, you've talked about them a little already. What can we as individuals do to help drive, conservation and reforestation efforts globally?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I was, kind of enumerating the number of actions that are being taken even within the US as of late on climate and related to forests, I think it really drives home the point that voting matters, right? Like it really matters to get out there and vote. Like democracy is fundamentally important for solving what are global problems, what are really complicated problems. That is a really meaningful action. And then actively telling our public officials we expect policies that prioritize forest health, climate solutions. I mean, we have this opportunity with this Forest Act. You can reach out to your representatives, express support for it, and then being mindful about the choices we make as consumers. There's a lot of opportunities to essentially vote with your dollar. And also thinking about the choices we make in purchasing, but also even before that, thinking about, is it possible to reuse or repurpose, or do you
Right.
need something, right? It's been really interesting to me to see this growing options for purchasing used furniture, housewares, or getting them for free from your community. And just if we're all doing those things, it does send signals, it does reinforce the behaviors and the actions that we want to see. And then the final thing I would say in that space of sort of choices is that agriculture and the expansion of agriculture for food production is the single largest driver of forest loss globally. And we should be mindful of, and really want to care and learn more about where our food comes from, how it was produced, and also not waste it. 40% of the food that's produced in the world is wasted, is one of the estimates, and that directly contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, because that could be land that was cleared to produce food that was never even eaten. And if we, can think about, how to, store, only buying what you need, store food properly, thinking about portion size, freezing your leftovers, composting. I mean, these are all things that I don't know if people think about are forest friendly actions, but they are part of the solution, and they're all things that are within our reach. So I would just, encourage folks that, and then also get out in the forest and be
Oh, right.
inspired.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think getting out there and just being able to appreciate the the beauty of the forests helps remind us the need to, integrate changes into our daily behavior that help preserve them. So, well, thanks, Carrie, so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge. It's definitely a complicated topic, but I think a really critical one. And so, yeah, thanks for coming on and being our guest.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to chat.
So, Todd, what did you think of the interview with Carrie? You learn anything new about the power of forests?
I did. I liked the quote, "Trees are determined and they don't give up." I like that. Um, I'm telling you, they're ants, man. They're coming alive, walking around. Um, no, I mean, it does seem like it's a big lift, and I hear numbers like we need to, reforest 678 million hectares. It just seems like a real daunting task, but also hits home the importance. And I should have known, maybe it caught me off guard, but to hear, that deforestation is, the second largest contributor to climate change, after the burning of fossil fuels. And I think I remembered that, but sometimes you forget these things and then you hear them again and you're just kind of like, whoa, I thought it was really informative. What about you? What were your takeaways?
I think similarly, I was reminded of the importance of forests, and I immediately found myself thinking back to the episodes we've done about meat and its
Mm,
impact on
yeah.
deforestation, the linkage there. The reality is it produces only about 17% of our food, and yet it takes up about 77% of ag land, and
Yep.
that that one stat to me just kind of says it all, right? If we want to, in the long run, give our forests a fighting chance, the biggest thing we can do is, consider what we're putting on our table. And
Mm-hmm.
and again, it's not to say that folks need to give up meat, but eating more plants, focusing on eating more plants and incorporating it, to me just feels like a key in all of this.
Yeah, it kind of gets back, especially I think, well, in the case of Brazil, probably to beef, right? Which is huge and kind of double, it has a kind of a double fold effect with the methane, and then you have the deforestation, and you're kind of getting it at both sides. You're dead on there, I think.
Yeah, and then the other thing that it kind of amazed me, I knew that tropical forests were important. We think of talking about forests here. The coastal forests on the western half of the U.S. are pretty amazing at pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and yet tropical rainforests have about 5 times the storage capacity of a coastal temperate rainforest. So yeah, it's not to diminish, because I think at this point every mature standing forest, we've got to think about protecting it, right? But it did for me really underscore how important it is that we're protecting these tropical forests.
Yeah, yeah, they're really kind of special in that way.
It's easy today to buy a product and getting pitched that folks are gonna plant a tree, and all that's great, but again, it's like we've got to protect the trees that are already standing first. I mean, that has to be priority, because
Yeah.
of, again, just the difference, right? I mean, I think Kerry said that if you reforest a hectare of land, you can count on pulling about I think 3 metric tons of CO2 per year, but having that, losing an existing hectare of tropical forest is 100 metric tons. So it just, again, it's
Yeah,
just an issue of scale. And not to diminish the whole, hey, we'll plant a tree in your honor, or plant a tree for
sure.
this or that. Like, it's definitely in the right direction, but we need to be careful to think that that's the only solution, right? That
Right.
yes, we need to be doing reforestation, but the first thing we need to do is stop the
Yeah.
deforestation that's going on. And so, yeah, those existing forests really are invaluable. And I mean, that got me thinking about, well, what are we doing at a global scale to really nip deforestation in the bud?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you did a little bit of reading on that and kind of what's happening right now. Well, what are we doing at a global scale to really nip deforestation in the bud?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, and I think if we go back to COP26, there was 100 countries that pledged to stop deforestation by 2030, and in that 100 countries, there's contains 85% of the world's forests. So obviously, a huge number, and a lofty goal. Some say it's not quick enough, but I think it was probably something they felt was doable. So this time, in comparison to, I think, the agreement in 2014, China and Brazil are on board, which obviously Brazil's huge because that's where a lot of the critical deforestation is happening. I think though, since 2014, that agreement really didn't stop much, and I think that's kind of the fear. Um, obviously we want Bolsonaro and Brazil to be involved, and to be a leader, but I don't know if what your take on that is, but I worry, I have serious worries about that happening, right? The pledge included, like $19.2 billion of investment, public and private funds. And I know that was huge because I think the money wasn't there before in 2014. And that's a huge part of making this happen, is that investment in it really has to be there. So I think that gives double hope that we can actually make some inroads on this time. Biden also pledged 9 billion at COP26. So, it seems like there's a lot more seriousness about the issue.
Yeah, I think it's good to sort of trust but verify, and
Yeah,
obviously the international community is going to have to continue to put pressure to make sure that these commitments have real teeth and follow through. But yeah, having Brazil on board is critical.
right. Also, there's the Forest Act, which I think is a huge deal, and kind of putting your money where your mouth is, right? Like if we say that we're going to value, the climate, and we have to stop supporting. And the other thing too is I think one of the reasons this is so huge, or would be so huge, is that people just don't know, right?
Yeah.
And when you pick that thing off the shelf, there's not like some little guy that's telling you, how that was made or what got killed to make that to
Right.
make that happen, right? And so this would kind of eliminate a lot of that guessing game.
Yeah. Well, I think the Force Act, if we can get it passed, would be a really big deal. And, Kerry mentioned it as well. And, I think that's really a good segue into, what can we do? And, for this week, we'd like to give folks two options. And if you're feeling really ambitious, do it both. But the first one is, tell your representatives to support the Forest Act that, that we've been talking about here. And, it would really be transformative, Todd, as you pointed out, because indirectly we are the contributor. We're driving this deforestation with the products that we consume.
Right. And I think there was also some bipartisan support of the Forest Act as well, which is something that's pretty uncommon these days. So, if you happen to have a, conservative legislator, you should, refer them to this thing because there's some bipartisan support out there already. So,
yeah, head over to our website. We'll have a link to an article that talks more about the Forests Act and what it's intended to do. And we'll have some talking points there for you to reach out to your representative. The second thing that we want to encourage folks to do this week is to, consider a donation to the World Wildlife Fund and all the critical work they're doing to conserve forests, restore forests, and better manage forests. Because, as Kerry pointed out, with the clock ticking, we really need to be doing all those things in parallel. And, organizations like WWF are kind of on the front lines of helping lead that work. So consider sending a donation their way.
Do it.
Any parting thoughts on trees, Todd?
I don't, but consider the tree spirits around you, the spirits of the trees. No, man, they're very powerful things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good reminder. Hey, if you haven't, had the time, go out and spend some time in the trees. All right, well, before I get too sappy about trees, let's put a wrap on it for this
sappy
week.
About trees.
Well, that's a wrap for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week. We'll be digging into kind of the nexus of money and climate. And don't forget to head over to our website, enter our prize drawing for that virtual home energy audit that'll be performed by none other than our own Thomas Mills. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimists.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.